These ABCs are going to be a 1, 2, 3.
How you get so big into food of this kind?
Hello and welcome in. Today I'm going to be doing a review on Star Wars Alphabet Squadron by Alexander Freed. Alphabet Squadron is the first book in a trilogy of the same name, with books 2 and 3 coming out later on in the future somewhere. This review is going to be basically spoiler-free. If you want spoiler discussion on the book, we did a full hour-long streamcast talking all about what we loved about the book. You can follow this link here to that discussion. But from here on, I'm just going to be talking about the book in broad terms for those of you who haven't read it and are trying to decide if you want to read it. I will be discussing the general structure of the novel. I will be discussing some of the characters in the novel. So it is ultimately spoiler-free. I'm not going to tell you how it ends. I'm not going to tell you what happens to certain characters, but I will be discussing some parts of the book, so you probably won't be able to say you're completely blind going into the book if you read it. But like I said, I'm not gonna get into anything super telling. As I said, the book is by Alexander Freed. You may know Alexander Freed from his other Star Wars New Canon novel, Battlefront Twilight Company, which is another fantastic book that I highly recommend everyone check out. He also did the novelization for Rogue One. Freed also has several other Star Wars writing credits to his name, including writing for the Old Republic comics in Legends. I greatly enjoyed Alphabet Squadron. I was not expecting to enjoy Alphabet Squadron. I wasn't expecting to hate it either. I'm not in Star Wars for the pilots, right? Like, I've read some of the X-Wing books from Legends, which this book is largely of interest to anybody who has read those. I like characters who were pilots, but like the pilot's life is not for me. It's not really what I'm into Star Wars for. But I read this with the expectation of still being able to enjoy it. See, I mentioned Twilight Company. Twilight Company was another novel that was about something that I didn't know I would enjoy all that much, and I ended up loving it. So I read this book hoping that Freed would pull another one over on me and make me enjoy a part of Star Wars that I'd never really gotten into in the same way as he'd done before, and he absolutely did. Highly recommend Alphabet Squadron. Now, with that, there were a couple of things in the beginning that I wasn't sure about, and I only say that because by the end of the novel, I didn't have a problem with them. And I say that in case you are a reader like me and these type of things might bother you, just to let you know, don't let them hang you up in the beginning. They're not actually a problem like I thought they were. But with that, I want to get into the structure of the book because that's largely what I'm talking about. So as a reader, one of the things I'm finicky about is pace, and this book is absolutely action-packed. There's always something going on. There's no part of the book that seems slow, but right at the beginning, there's a lot of characters. There's a lot of characters. There are the primary members of Alphabet Squadron, the 5 characters, and if you followed Del Rey's marketing in any way, you know who they were. So with that, I was able to kind of go in and know who was going to be a more important character for me to follow, and that was a big help. But at the very least, I would say as you go in, if you read a chapter from a character's perspective, that's a character to focus on. If you haven't read a chapter from a certain character's perspective, they're important in the same way that any part of a book is important, but really remembering every single aspect of what's going on is not going to be as critical as it is for those 5. For me, I was like, this book's called Alphabet Squadron, I'm so many pages in and there is no Alphabet Squadron, there's too many characters for me to keep track of, I don't know what's going on, and there's no dramatis persona, and I was like panicking a little bit. Don't let that get you down. Like I said, focus on any character that gets their own perspective, or look at the character posters. Like, those are the ones to be mainly concerned about. The too many characters situation is not going to be a situation for the whole book. The book does eventually narrow in and focus on what it needs to do, which is showing us how the characters all bond together. And that's what I was saying about pacing. While the book is always action-packed, the pacing seemed a little odd to me. Usually, in a book like this, especially if you're looking at some of the X-Wing books, you have the first book where early on everyone kind of comes together and the roster gets filled out, and then they all go on the adventures, and maybe partway through the book they pick up a new straggler or something. But this was like halfway through, really, before I felt like all the characters I wanted to meet had met. I wasn't sure what to do with that, and by the time I got to the end of the book, it made sense. I totally understood why the book was paced that way. I totally understood why we had spent time with characters we did in the way that we did. Just because that's one of my sticking points, I was a little unsure, but by the end of it, absolutely everything that happened in the book had a point, had a purpose. There was no just kind of random tangents for the sake of random tangents, and I was thoroughly happy. So I don't mean that to sound as like a negative thing. It really isn't. It was just one of those like beginning of the book jitters thing that had resolved for me by the end of the book. within that, some of those early chapters were providing some really unusual stories that we had in Star Wars in a very good way. Really created some unique situations. Again, we talk about these more in our spoiler discussion. I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but there are some really poignant scenes that happen because this book really lets the characters breathe at the beginning and lets us take time to get to know them. That is the advantage of this being a trilogy as opposed to a story that has to tell everything in one book. And it's something that this book does very well. This book has a very well done beginning, middle, and end. Oftentimes in like first books of trilogies, you'll get so much time being introduced to new characters, so much time being introduced to the state of what's going on in that book's world, in that book's universe. And this book does all of that. There is a lot of introduction to character. There is a lot of introduction to what's going on in the story, but it's done along the lines of its own story, and there's more to the story than just here's where the pilots meet and here's where the pilots bond. I was really impressed with how there was a story woven into this introduction that continued to make the introduction and all of the early exposition engaging. Basically, the book hides an information dump well. And again, I don't, like, every book has to do that. Every book has to tell you who its characters are, what their motivations are, what's going on. And this book was able to very organically reveal those things for the reader. Which brings me to the next part, the characters themselves. There's a lot of really good emotional stuff going on with the characters in this book. And what's interesting is every person I've talked to who's read this book has had a completely different experience. When I read through, I was most engaged by, I was most intrigued by the person who is arguably the main character out of an ensemble cast. There isn't necessarily a main character, but this is the character on the cover. That is the character of Quell. I was invested in her story beginning to end, totally along for the ride. I liked all of the characters in the book. The only characters I didn't like in the book were the characters I wasn't supposed to like. That's not the issue at hand. She was just the one that I most latched on to while I was reading. But then I talked to other people who latched on to Will Lark, or people who latched on to Chess, other main characters within the story, and depending on who they identified with the most, the book kind of came alive for them in a different way, and it's made talking about the book very interesting. And that's really what it does well, and that's what I was talking about earlier in the review, about how this book kind of made a book about pilots interesting to me, because it focused so much on the people. Usually with pilot books, what kind of turns me off from them is they're exceptionally technical. You know, they're going into huge detail on the parts of a ship or how the ship flies, and I just am, that's not what I'm into. And while this book does have this stuff, so if you are a tech head and you like reading books for tech heads, you will have plenty of things in here to enjoy. The emotion in the book made all of that engaging for me as well. Like, there was something in this book for me. Really, what it showed is that there's a character in this book for everyone. No matter what kind of stories you like to hear, no matter what kind of characters that you like to follow on a journey, like, one of the characters in this book is probably going to do that for you. It's just done in a really exceptional way, and the way that they reveal things about the characters is, I liked it. I really enjoyed it. I'm so excited for books 2 and 3, and it did some very unique things in Star Wars canon and how the story unfolded. Besides our main characters and our main plotline, the book exists in 3 acts, parts 1, 2, and 3. At the end of parts 1, 2, and 3, each part has a bit of an epilogue, if you will, and each of those kind of epilogues, interludes, whatever you want to call them, follows its own kind of 3-act story. And that kind of created this mystery as you were going along, like, oh, I'm reading this part that has seemingly nothing to do with anything else in the story. I wonder what it has to do with anything. And you get to not only the end of Alphabet Squadron, the end of part 3, but then you get the end of this epilogue, this interlude story, and you're like, oh, and just seeing how everything came together. I had such an emotional reaction to, like, the end of every character's story in this book. It's not what I was expecting, but it is what I was hoping for, with it being written by Freed. So I would say this is a must for anybody who likes their pilot books, their team-up books, their squad books. Like I said, there is the techie stuff, if that's what you're into. If you like Rebels and Imperial story. There's a lot going on here. I didn't even get to the Imperial end of things, where you do get to learn a little bit more on the Imperial side. Of course, that's also discussed more in the tie-in comic TIE Fighter by Jody Houser. These stories kind of work in tandem. TIE Fighter's telling one part of the story, and the Alphabet Squadron Trilogy is telling another part. So there's absolutely stuff in there for you if you're that kind of fan. But even if those aren't really what you're into Star Wars for, you can still absolutely enjoy this book, because I absolutely enjoyed this book. Let me know what you guys thought of the book. Did you read it? Are you planning to read it? Please leave us a comment down below. If you're not already, please follow us on the various social medias. And until next time, keep it real and fly casual.
Cooking can be fun.